What if I told you that the most dangerous person is someone who feels completely healthy? Do you know that feeling when you're convinced you're right and the whole world is trying to prove you wrong? This is the story of Mary Mallon, a woman who was a walking biological bomb but refused to believe it. And it's the story of how society locked her in solitary confinement for 23 years, not for what she did, but for what she was. Compare her to a gun that doesn't know it's loaded. She was sentenced to life imprisonment for a crime her mind didn't commit, but her body constantly did. Imagine a bacterium that turns a person into a factory for contagion, yet doesn't harm the host at all. In the early 20th century, the very idea of an asymptomatic carrier sounded like science fiction. For doctors, and for Mary herself, it was an unthinkable paradox. How could you spread a deadly disease if you didn't even have a runny nose? This idea was just beginning to be promoted in Europe by Nobel laureate Robert Koch, but for most American doctors, it was like discussing telepathy. A person is a vessel with symptoms, no disease, period. Summer of 1906, Oyster Bay, New York. The wealthy banker Charles Warren's family hires a new cook, an Irish woman named Mary Mallon. She's an excellent cook, especially her peach ice cream. But a week after her arrival, 6 of the 11 people in the house fall ill with typhoid fever, a disease of the poor and dirty slums. How could it appear in this sterile paradise for the elite? Panic ensues, and it was that very ice cream, which was not heat-treated, that became the perfect vehicle for the bacteria. The cold, sweet dessert, prepared by Mary's hands, turned into a slow-release bacteriological bomb. Who is this invisible killer infiltrating New York's most protected homes? Why does it only choose the rich? And the main question that would turn the entire healthcare system upside down: can a person with no symptoms and no malicious intent, but who sows death with every touch of food, be forcibly isolated? This was a legal and ethical dilemma that can be formulated as, whose right is more important, one person's right to freedom of movement or hundreds of people's right to life? This question transformed Mary Mallon's case from a medical anomaly into a legal precedent. The homeowner hires George Soper, a sanitary engineer, a kind of epidemic detective. Soper is a man of science. He doesn't believe in curses. He methodically checks everything: water, milk, shellfish, sewage. Everything is clean, a dead end. But then he notices one detail. 3 weeks before the outbreak, the family hired a new cook, and this cook disappeared. Soper wasn't a doctor, but an engineer, a Sherlock Holmes of hygiene. While doctors searched for a sick patient, Soper looked for a breach in the system, in the very environment where the disease originated. Soper began to act not like a medic, but like a financial auditor who seeks not a single counterfeiter, but a systemic vulnerability through which money is leaking. He was obsessed with the idea that the typhoid in the Warren home was not an accident, but the result of someone's actions. He starts digging into the past and learns the cook's name, Mary Mallon. For Soper, she wasn't a person, but a variable in the epidemic equation, and he begins the titanic work of tracking her entire employment history over the past 7 years. A monstrous picture emerges. Mamaroneck, 1900, a typhoid outbreak. Manhattan, 1901, the family she worked for falls ill. Dark Harbor, 1902, 7 people get sick, and so on. 7 families, 22 sick, and at least 1 confirmed death. Soper literally charted her career path, and this path looked like the trajectory of a deadly comet. The pattern was not just suspicious, it was mathematically irrefutable. Wherever Mary appeared, typhoid began. It was then that Soper reached a conclusion that was ahead of its time. Mary is not a victim. She is the source. She is the healthy carrier whispered about in Europe. Her body had become the perfect incubator for Salmonella typhi bacteria. According to his theory, her gallbladder functioned as a bioreactor, an impregnable fortress where bacteria could multiply for years, completely protected from her own immune system, and then exit with every meal she prepared. This was a classic Cassandra effect. Soper saw the full picture of the epidemic, but almost no one believed him. His evidence was indirect, statistical, not direct and obvious, like a patient's fever. He faced a choice: act on his crazy theory and save dozens of lives, or back down and ruin his reputation, jeopardizing the health of the entire city. He looks at the map of New York again and again. On it are the points where Mary worked, and next to each point, an outbreak of infection flares up. Imagine a murder map from a police station. Each new pin is not just an address, it's the epicenter of a new outbreak. The map transformed from geographical to epidemiological, and all threads led to one person who didn't even know she was a criminal. This was no longer a theory. It became visual proof. Soper realizes he must find her immediately before she takes a new job with another family and prepares her signature peach dessert. And he finds her. She's working as a cook in a house on Park Avenue. He knows he can't just show up with the police. He needs evidence, samples for analysis. He goes to meet the most dangerous woman in New York to disarm a biological bomb. But to do that, he first needs to convince the bomb itself that it's about to explode. An almost impossible task. Soper enters the kitchen. He tries to speak calmly, scientifically, as if to a colleague, about bacteria, hygiene, the need for tests, but in response, he doesn't get fear, not surprise. He gets pure primal rage. Mary screams that he's persecuting her, trying to cost her her job and good name. She's never been sick in her life, and at some point, words fail. She grabs a large carving fork and lunges at him. The weapon of defense becomes an ironic symbol of her profession. She defends her craft with the tool of her craft. Soper barely manages to escape to the street. Now let's look at it through her eyes. She is a proud Irish immigrant, an independent woman, and then some gentleman in an expensive coat shows up. He accuses her of being the source of a plague, even though her throat doesn't even hurt. To her, it sounds like a rich man's conspiracy to fire her without severance pay. She is not just defending her freedom, she is defending her right to consider herself healthy. This was a classic example of the curse of knowledge. Soper was so confident in his scientific worldview that he missed the main point. To a person without his knowledge, his words sounded like an accusation of witchcraft. He spoke the language of microbiology. She responded in the language of common sense. Soper realizes convincing her is impossible. He goes to the Department of Health. Now, it's not a private detective hunting Mary, but the entire state apparatus, 5 policemen and doctor. Sarah Josephine Baker arrived to take her by force, but Mary doesn't give up. She fights back, scratches, struggles like a cornered animal. For her, it's not an arrest, it's a kidnapping. For them, it's an emergency quarantine. The chase lasted 5 hours. They searched the house floor by floor until they found her. She was huddled in a closet in the basement. They literally dragged her out, desperately clinging to the doorframe. This was a scene not from medical practice, but from a crime report. She is forcibly placed in an ambulance. It's not a rescue, it's a convoy. At the hospital, she is coercively tested, and the results confirm Soper's wildest theory. Her stool is literally teeming with typhoid bacteria. The diagnosis is made. Mary Mallon is the first officially registered asymptomatic carrier in United States history. This was no accident. Of the 163 samples taken from her during her first confinement, 120 were positive. Her body was a veritable, non-stop factory for producing Salmonella typhi. And here the system reaches an impasse. What to do with her? She is not a criminal, she had no malicious intent, but she is a biological weapon. The authorities make a decision for which there is no precedent. Send her to North Brother Island quarantine, without trial, without sentence, for life, simply for what her body is. North Brother Island was New York's medical Alcatraz, a place of exile for those with smallpox and tuberculosis. But Mary was the first to be exiled there in perfect health. Her crime was her own biology. Mary is brought to her new home, a tiny cottage on an isolated island in the middle of the East River. She is a prisoner of her own body. But she has no intention of giving up. She begins writing letters to newspapers. She seeks out lawyers. She argues that she has become a victim of medical tyranny. She files a lawsuit with the Supreme Court, citing the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the right to liberty. Her case became the first high-profile clash in history between the rights of one individual and the safety of society as a whole. And one day, the system would falter. For almost 3 years, Mary wages war from her island. Her story becomes a sensation. The press, led by media mogul William Randolph Hearst, father of yellow journalism, brands her for life, Typhoid Mary. He turns her personal tragedy into a commodity. Public opinion is divided. Some see her as a monster, others as a victim. Mary herself continues to send samples to an independent laboratory, and one day receives a negative result. It's a mistake, a fluke, but for her, it's proof of a conspiracy. She is healthy. In 1910, a new commissioner came to the Department of Health. He considered Mary's confinement inhumane and excessive. He offered her a deal: freedom in exchange for an oath that she would never again work as a cook and would strictly observe hygiene. This was not just a gentleman's agreement. Mary signed an official document, an affidavit, in which she swore in black and white that she understood her danger to society. Exhausted by isolation, she agreed without hesitation. Upon gaining her freedom, Mary tries to start a new life. She works as a laundress, but this job pays her half as much as being a cook. For a proud, independent woman, this is not just a financial blow. It's a psychological humiliation. She cannot come to terms with her new status, and then she makes a decision that will determine her fate. She disappears. And somewhere in New York, a new cook appears, a certain Mrs. Mary Brown. 5 years pass. In 1915, a new typhoid outbreak shakes the city. And this time it occurs in the most terrifying place, Sloan Hospital for Women, a maternity ward. Death takes root in a place created for new life. 25 people, mostly doctors and nurses, fall ill. 2 die. It's a disaster. And once again, George Soper's phone rings. He is asked to find the source, and he already knows who to look for. The investigation takes only a few days. All leads point to the hospital kitchen. The police ask about the cook, Mrs. Brown. They are shown the woman preparing food. It's Mary Mallon. This time she doesn't fight back with a fork. She doesn't scream. She doesn't try to run. She just stays silent. The game is over. According to one account, at the moment of her arrest, she was not just cooking, but packing food into containers for shipment outside the hospital. She was ready to spread the infection even further. Society, which once sympathized with her, was now enraged. Her deception, her broken oath that cost lives, was unforgivable. Newspapers that once wrote about her as a victim now called her a walking typhoid reservoir. Public opinion had turned 180 degrees. This time, there would be no deals. The verdict would be final and irreversible. Mary Mallon is returned to North Brother Island. This time, she is told, this is forever. It is no longer a temporary quarantine. It is a life sentence without the right to appeal. She became a national symbol of irresponsibility. Her case created a precedent in American law known as the police power of the state, the right to restrict the freedom of one person to save many. Her personal liberty was laid on the altar of public good. But her life in captivity was paradoxical. She wasn't confined to a cell. She was given a job as a lab assistant at the hospital on the same island. The woman who vehemently denied the existence of bacteria was now washing test tubes and petri dishes for scientists. She became a servant of the very science that condemned her. Journalists came to visit her. She became a celebrity, America's most wanted woman, confined to a few acres of land. Let's pause here. On the scale of justice versus safety, where does this verdict fall? On one side is the fundamental human right to freedom. On the other, society's right to protection from a deadly threat. This is a classic trolley problem, moved from a philosophy textbook to a public health department. Are you willing to sacrifice the freedom of one to save the lives of many? Mary's story is not a hypothetical problem. It's a real case where officials had to pull the lever. Years passed. Typhoid Mary was gradually forgotten. She became a local legend of the island, a ghost wandering the shore. In 1932, at the age of 63, she suffered a massive stroke. Paralysis did what neither law nor science could. It finally disarmed her. She spent the next 6 years confined to a hospital bed, helpless, lonely. The only living creature by her side was a dog she was allowed to keep. She died in 1938, having spent a total of 26 years in isolation. Death was not a release for her. Science wasn't done with Mary Mallon. Doctors performed an autopsy, and they found what George Soper had predicted decades ago. Her gallbladder was literally packed with live typhoid bacteria. It was like opening a time capsule. Her body had held the main evidence for decades, becoming the final, irrefutable proof. Science put a final period on her case, confirming both her correctness, she truly wasn't sick, and Soper's correctness, she was deadly dangerous. Mary Mallon's story changed everything. It forced the world to acknowledge the existence of asymptomatic carriers. Hundreds of others were found after her, but they were treated differently. For example, bakery owner Tony Labella, who infected over 100 people, was not isolated. He was helped to sell his business and find safe employment. The lesson was learned. Cooperation works better than coercion. Mary became a victim whose personal hell served as a cruel but necessary lesson for all civilization. Her name became an insult, but her story is something more than just a medical case. The story of Typhoid Mary is more than just a thriller. It's a survival guide in a world of invisible threats. From her tragedy, we draw 3 key lessons that are relevant even today. This is a condensed patient zero protocol. The term patient zero itself emerged later, during the HIV epidemic, but Mary Mallon is rightly considered its archetype. She is the first identified asymptomatic carrier from whom the investigation began. The first and most important lesson: the absence of symptoms does not mean the absence of disease. This idea, proven at the cost of lives, underlies all modern epidemiology. A person can be a perfect weapon for a virus, even without realizing it. This forces us to look at hygiene in a new way. And it's the main nightmare of any pandemic, which we all realized during COVID-19. Mary's story was the first alarm bell. The most dangerous spreader is not the one who coughs in a crowd, but the one who looks and feels perfectly healthy. The second lesson: the eternal conflict between individual rights and public safety. Where does the freedom of one end and the right of others to life begin? There is no simple answer. Each generation seeks its own balance, but Mary's case shows how high the price of error can be. It's like traffic laws. We voluntarily limit our freedom to ensure general safety. The question with Mary was whether a person could be forbidden to drive at all if their vehicle, their body, was deemed faulty and deadly. The third lesson: science is powerless without trust. Why did Mary refuse to cooperate? Not just because of stubbornness. Soper and the doctors spoke down to her like an ignorant immigrant. Science is the engine, but trust is the fuel. Without it, the most powerful engine won't move. Soper came to Mary with facts, but without empathy, and as a result, he got not cooperation, but a carving fork. Fear and denial are as dangerous pathogens as the bacteria themselves. So who is ultimately to blame for this tragedy? Mary's unyielding stubbornness, who consciously broke her oath, or the cruelty of a system that found no other way to protect society than to lock her up forever? According to official data, she is linked to 51 cases of infection and 3 deaths, but historians believe the real numbers could be many times higher. Your decision, who is to blame, depends on whether you consider these deaths the result of her choice or a systemic failure.